Are we failing to teach these kids resilience right now with this everybody gets a trophy mentality?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say I've had this conversation a lot, and the everyone gets a trophy. I'll say I don't agree with, but also like kids know, right? So by giving everyone a trophy for participation, like kids know, right? Like they know if they're good, they know if they're not good, right? So they know where they are, right? Um, so again, I I I don't think competition is a bad thing, right? Some people might think that competition isn't great, but I think competition is a good thing if it's taught properly. And again, back to these sport environments, like it's okay to compete, but also back to that self improvement, right? So some of those things make sport fun, but also like back to what are we teaching these children in terms of like life skills that they're going to need.
I've got two boys. They're 7 years apart, actually, and I coached both of them in basketball, which I know very little about. So I was kind of like the bus driver, but somebody had to do it. So I was the coach, and it was at the Y. So you go into these age brackets, 10 and under. The first year you're in that age bracket, you're playing against kids that are the last year in that age bracket. So the first year we were like 1-13. But when they won that one game, they were delirious that they
Yeah.
finally won
Yep.
a game. If we had celebrated every game that we lost, then it would have cheapened the win. And then the next year, they won 5 or 6. And then the last year, they did really well. And they really
Yeah.
loved making that improvement.
Yep.
I think competition
Yeah.
is great. They learned about this. Hey, we can get better.
Yeah. And actually, the word competition, if you break it down, it actually means strive together. So we've lost a little bit of what that definition of that word means, but I think that's really powerful in terms of striving together, right? So we push each other, we challenge each other, we support each other, and that can be a really, really beautiful thing when done right.
Resilience just seems to be really important and something that we're letting slip away right now. So I'm glad to hear you say that. I think it's a good thing to fall down and get back up.
I would agree with that, and I think there's some you have these life experiences, you have these things, and then I love diving into the psychology and frameworks and things like that. And there's a beautiful framework on resiliency with Olympic champions. And I love that because the model really looks at like what's happening. How do I respond to this in a good way? What's my motivation? What's my focus? What's my social support, right? So what social support do I have? And then some psychology terms, 'cause I like them, but our metacognitions or our kind of our appraisal, our cognitive appraisal, right? So basically, how do we think about these things, right? So how am I interpreting what's happening, right? So sometimes if we think about something that's really hard that we need to be resilient from, right? So how are we perceiving this challenge? What are we telling ourselves? What is the support that we have from other people? What are we motivated to do out of that, right? Which then comes our response. So I think, again, just kind of breaking down resiliency and what we're wanting to see, some of those psychological frameworks actually help us understand what might be missing, right? Do they have the support? Are they being more negative or harder, self-critical of themselves? And like, how do we help facilitate the responses to help them through to be more resilient?
Performance wise, do you work with these athletes on their specific internal dialogue?
Yeah, I think in general, those are, if we step back and just think of mental skills, right? And so this is what I teach from is we practice our skills as athletes, right? So whatever that is, if you're a hurdler, if you're a long jumper, if you're a basketball player, if you're a football player, and if you think about these, we practice our physical skills, but oftentimes we're not practicing our mental skills, right? So one of the mental skills that I teach from is self-talk, right? What is that internal dialogue? How am I talking myself through or coaching myself through? And self-talk can be either motivational, right? Like you can do this, come on, right? Whatever that internal dialogue is. Or it can be instructional, right? Lift your leg up, drive your hips through, right? So all of that self-talk can be really helpful in that moment, but it's one of many mental skills that I work with athletes on.
And different athletes respond to different kinds of
That's right.
self-talk, right?
Yeah. I mean, I am definitely a positive self-talk person, right? So not so much being negative and critical, but offering some compassion too. But I think depending on the individual's personality and what works for them, right, there's different things that are going to work for certain athletes. So one of the things that I talk to athletes about is really understanding your own psychology, right? And you have to understand what your mind does and where it goes when things get really hard. And so that's your job. Like I can work with you on these things, but you've got to really understand your own psychology and work through it in those moments to best help yourself perform when it really, really counts.
So let's talk about pressure. What is your approach to helping people perform at that critical moment when it's their opportunity to choke or their opportunity to really step up and excel? Do you have a particular strategy, approach, philosophy about teaching athletes to deal with those big pressure moments?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a great question. When you first brought that up, I worked with a coach once that said pressure doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist, right? So in their mind, that's how they dealt with it, was just saying like it doesn't matter, right? And then you hear the cliches of like, well, pressure builds diamonds, and there's all of these things with dealing with pressure. But I think in general, ideally, we've prepared our athletes for this moment, right? So the best athletes of the best athletes just live for those pressure moments, right? And this is when we see in the movies where like things get like foggy and kind of zoom out and you just see this like tunnel vision, right? And the best athletes like live for those moments and know exactly what to do. But even with that, they've probably had these moments as they've gone through sport to know how to handle those moments, right? So if we think about your progression and your development as an athlete, probably early on, there were coaches that helped them have those moments so that now when there are these big moments in the Super Bowl or whatever it is, they know how to manage those. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, are you saying acknowledge it and have a strategy for it when it comes up?
Well, I would say the best of the best, like live for those moments. But I would say too, in those moments, right? So you take control of what happens, right? So you know exactly what you're doing, you know exactly the play, you know exactly how you're going to, what you need to do, and you stay focused on the moment, right? So you don't get overwhelmed by the moment, but you're able to like recognize where your mind is, you're able to put it where it needs to be and like block out any distractions that might be there, right? So whatever that is, the winning free throw of a basketball game, right? So you know exactly like stay with your routine, take your deep breath, do your shot, right? So really being able to control your mind to stay focused on the task at hand to deliver your best performance in that moment. And when we see athletes maybe fall apart in those moments, probably because they were distracted outside of the moment. Something caught their attention, their mind wandered, they became overwhelmed as opposed to really dialing in, taking control of that moment and delivering your best performance in that moment.